This is a video I've been intending to make for quite some time. I've just been trying to figure out the best way to go about it. If you watch my channel, you know that I repair all manner of vintage equipment, electronic, mechanical, and things of interest, but quite often they are irreplaceable and extremely rare. And even if they're not, really I don't want them arriving here damaged. And quite often you'll see items advertised on eBay and they look in quite good condition, but when they arrive at your doorstep they are very badly damaged, they've been very badly packaged, and almost invariably when you contact the seller and mention the damage, they say, well, it was sold as not working, so what does it matter if it gets damaged in transit? Which I think is a particularly stupid response. The other issue is quite often people don't really understand the best way to go about packaging things. If you've seen some of my recent videos in the Hazeltine terminal, for example, the HP 85B, I've been exchanging large, very delicate equipment with a guy over in the US for quite some time now. And we ship things back and forward to us, and while I don't want to tempt fate, we are very successful. We package them very carefully. Some have spent months in transit, but they always seem to turn up without any significant damage, if any damage at all. And although you can't guarantee things won't get damaged, accidents happen in transit, you can take some decent precautionary measures. And what I'm going to show in this video is what the term double boxing means. It seems to be a term that's used a lot, and I don't think often people really understand what it is. And I'll also show some examples of items that have turned up on my doorstep where the sender claims they were double boxed and they just weren't. And what I've been trying to figure out in terms of making this video is how to go about getting across the differences between the different types of packaging. Now, it's a very difficult thing to try and demonstrate and test, and I'm not suggesting that what I'm doing here is the best way to go about it, but it should hopefully give some indication as to the general principles involved and why certain things work and other things don't. So what I've got here is I've made up this force sensor. So this plastic part at the front, this cream colour thing, is a force sensor that I've made specifically for this test, and it's two layers of plastic with some force sensors sandwiched in between, and the whole thing's bonded together, and it's set up to measure forces over a certain limit, and there's a kind of a foam sandwich between the two, so it allows a little bit of movement, not much, maybe a hundredth of a millimeter, but it's enough to give us a sensible and consistent force measurement. And it's not a point sensor. That was one of the things I was struggling to try and get across when I was thinking of doing this video, was that I don't want a single point force. I'm trying to measure impacts as they would appear to an item that's in a box that's been packaged. So this is kind of an area force sensor. There are multiple sensors in here, so it measures an area of force, and it displays on the scope the average force that it sees. Now, one of the things we're trying to do when we package something, there's two main things we're trying to achieve. One is we want to try and avoid damage due to impacting the surface of the item, and also we're trying to avoid internal damage of the item. The internal damage is caused by sudden sharp jolts, and the external damage is obviously incursions or sharp blows to the outside. So the way this is set up on our scope, any sharp spikes would represent a sudden jolt, and the amplitude is the force applied. So what we're really aiming for is to try and get as small an amplitude signal as we can, and as kind of gentle and curved as we can, and that will be analogous to the least amount of damage that we can provide. So to give an idea, what I've got here is a reel of solder. This represents the outside world, and the force sensor is of course our item that would normally be inside the box. So I'm going to pull this back. Now what I'm doing, although you won't be able to see this, is I've got a kind of graticule on my camera so I can pull it back to the same position each time. You can't see it because it's on the viewfinder side, but I'll be pulling it back about 5 inches each time we do a test. I'm not going to pull it back all the way for the first test because there's no packaging and the sensor could get damaged. So if I let this go and you watch the scope, you'll see that there is quite a significant signal. Try it one more time. And you can see we're getting quite large spikes, and if we do a single capture, you can see the 2 impacts because it hits one side and the other, but they're both pretty much the same, and they're quite sharp spikes with high amplitude, and that's what we're trying to get rid of. So in order to do this, we obviously need to put the item in some packaging, and that's what we're looking at here. Now the simplest form of packaging is of course just a cardboard box. So what we're going to do now is put the item in a cardboard box, and we'll see what difference, if any, that makes. So we'll pull the item back. Again, I'm not going to go all the way back here, simply because this doesn't provide much protection. Again, I don't want to damage the sensor. If I now let this go, you'll see that although it's reduced the amplitude, and it's also, if I increase the time-based speed, it's also slowed down the impact response a little bit. It's not as sharp as it was. So we'll do one more to the same point, and you can see it's quite a high amplitude impact, and it's quite sharp, so that would really represent very little protection for the item. So what people normally do is put some bubble wrap in there, but what I'm going to do before that is show a few of the techniques that I've seen people use to try and protect their item. So the first one, and I really have seen all these, I'll try and find the photographs. The first one is cling film. I've actually had items turn up with nothing more than a few layers of cling film on them, and there's normally the industrial cling film that you normally would use to attach things to pallets with, but it really doesn't do very much, so as you'd expect. So we'll try this again. I won't pull the weight all the way back, and as you can see, cling film's not going to do much to protect your item, so that's one that we can discount as being viable. The other one is people will put items in a cardboard box, but the next technique they will use is to write fragile on it. So let's see if that makes any difference. We've written the word fragile. Let's see if that cuts down the force that is being applied to our priceless item. And no, the word fragile doesn't really seem to do much. Another technique I've seen, and I said I really have seen these, another technique I've seen is for people to draw smiley faces on their packaging. So let's try that. See if the smiley faces protect our priceless item. Back to the same point. And no, they don't. If anything, it seems to have made it worse. Perhaps our item doesn't like the smiley face. Okay, so that didn't work. The next step is to try various different types of packaging. So one that is normally fairly successful is some fairly thick foam. And what I'm going to do now is move the item back, because I want this to be in a neutral point before I let go of it. So we'll get this back to where it's neutral, which is there. We'll pull it back the same distance, rearm the scope, and let's see. And you can see that hasn't even triggered the scope. So we can now start pulling the weight all the way back. This is how far back I will normally be swinging it from. And so you can see that the packaging has made quite some difference there. It's a nice, a much gentler curve, although the amplitude is still fairly high. So it's still, although it's protected the item, it's not really that good. It's still allowing quite a bit of force to get through. So the next thing that's normally tried is a few layers of bubble wrap. So obviously it's inside the box. Move the item back to the point where it's just touching the weight. So I can now release the weight from the intended distance, which is there. And as you can see, bubble wrap does make a huge difference, and that really would help protect. You can see it's a much shallower curve, and it's not a particularly high amplitude. So bubble wrap, quite good. 5 layers of bubble wrap here, but can we do any better than this? So next thing we can try is some large cell bubble wrap. So we'll start off with 2 layers of large cell bubble wrap. Rearm the scope, and now pull the weight back to the same point. Okay, so 2 layers of large cell bubble wrap isn't quite as good as 5 layers of standard bubble wrap, but it's fairly close. And again, it's evened out the curve. It's nice shallow curve, so that gives us good shock protection for the item inside. There's only so far you can go doing this. It, after a while, doesn't make any difference because the item moves around. So the next thing we can try is some brown paper, and again this is something I have seen. So a couple of layers of brown paper, we'll see if this will protect our item. Let's get it back into a neutral position. Now of course I won't pull it too far back. And no, brown paper is not really going to do much. Let's try brown paper inside some cardboard, which again is something I have seen. And no, that doesn't really do any good. So now we'll get on to the more sensible ways of packaging things. This is a bit tongue-in-cheek, but I have seen these and I have had items turn up this way. So we've seen that bubble wrap and large cell foam make a difference. So now we'll go on to double boxing and what it is and why it makes a difference. So the first thing in double boxing and what it isn't, so I'll demonstrate what it's not first. It's not putting a piece of cardboard against your item. In other words, it's not putting the item in a cardboard box and then putting some bubble wrap around the outside, followed by putting the entire thing inside another box. That's not double boxing. So we'll try that anyway and see if we get a decent result. There. Okay, so you can see it's given some additional protection. Not very much, it's evened out the curve a little bit, but really hasn't done that much to protect the item. That's because the inner box is right up against the item, so it's not really going to do much to protect it. So double boxing is not putting an item in a cardboard box, putting some bubble wrap around the outside of it, and then putting that inside a box. What double boxing is where you take your item and wrap it in bubble wrap. You then put that in a cardboard box, and then you put some more bubble wrap around the outside. We'll use our dual cell bubble wrap here, and then that goes inside a cardboard box. So that's double boxing. It's wrapping the item in a decent packing material. It can be foam, it can be foam chips, it can be large cell or small cell bubble wrap, but then it goes inside a cardboard box. The cardboard is not up against the item, that won't really give it much protection. And then you do the same thing again. You put that box inside some bubble wrap and then put that inside an outer cardboard box. You can write the word fragile and draw smiley faces as well if you prefer. But what we'll do now is we'll bring the weight back is there, and release. And you can see it hasn't even triggered the scope, so we'll bring it back still further. Okay, so despite releasing the weight from much further back, you can see the curve is much shallower. It's very nice and rounded over, low amplitude despite the increased impact, so we're not applying shock loads to the item inside, and it's protecting the outside of the item as well. So as I said, the double boxing is put the item in some bubble wrap, put it inside a cardboard box, some more bubble wrap, and then all that goes inside an outer box, and that is the best way to protect an item. And I've never had an item damaged in transit that's been packaged like this. Now it does add to the cost, of course, but the items are generally irreplaceable, so it's worth the extra effort. And if you want to charge extra for shipping it, then charge extra for shipping it. As long as it's reasonable and you're not being extortionate, then people will rather pay an extra few pounds, extra few dollars to have a sheet or two of bubble wrap in an extra cardboard box, rather than having something that's irreplaceable turn up irreversibly damaged. And so please, if you've got something to sell, try to wrap it in such a way it's likely to get to the destination intact. If somebody's given you money for something, they've done that because they want the item in the condition that you're advertising it, and the excuse that, well, it was broken anyway, what does it matter if it's further broken, is silly. Try to get it to the buyer in the same condition that it is before you send it. If you're not quite sure how to go about it, then just ask the buyer what they want. Are they willing to pay extra to have it shipped in such a way that it's protected, or are they willing to take the risk of you just putting a layer of cling film around it? Okay, well, hopefully you found that interesting, if not useful. But any comments are welcome, and I'll be interested to hear any stories of items that people have bought that have turned up damaged.